Hello and welcome. I'm Oles Garjuk and you're watching Head to Head with UATV. Today on May 9th, Ukraine marks the day of victory over Nazism in World War II. According to estimates, between 8 to 10 million Ukrainians were killed during the war. Over 700 cities and towns, as well as almost 30,000 villages were destroyed. Ukrainians replaced the Soviet concept of Victory Day back in 2015. To talk more about this, we welcome to our studio today Igor Bigun, historian at the Center for Research on the Liberation Movement. Hello and thank you for being with us today.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. So as I said, Ukraine replaced the concept, changed the approach of the celebrations, but I would like to remind that on May 8th, Ukrainians marked the Day of Remembrance and Reconciliation for the first time. Back in 2015, Verkhovna Rada, Ukraine's parliament, introduced this holiday. Could you explain the audience why does Ukraine have two holidays, on May 8th and on May 9th, to commemorate the anniversary?
Well, in fact, the 9th of May, the Victory Day, was inherited by Ukraine from the Soviet Union, from the Soviet. It is like Soviet tradition. But in fact, the Nazi Germany, capitulated on the May 8th.
1945.
1945, exactly. The very act of capitulation was signed the day before, on the May 7th, in the town of Reims, in front of the Western Allies.
But what meant the day of May 9th then? What happened that day?
The matter is that the Soviet leader, the Joseph Stalin, was very astonished that the German troops capitulated in front of Western Allies, in front of Americans and the English troops, but not in front of the Red Army. He thought that the Soviet Union made the biggest contribution to the defeat of Hitler. So the Germany had to capitulate before the Red Army. So Stalin insisted that they make another second act of capitulation on the 8th of May in the town of Karlshorst, in the German town of Karlshorst, in front of the Soviet generals. And as far as this document was signed, it was the evening of the 8th of May, and according to the Moscow time, it was the 9th of May, night of the 9th of May. So this date, the May 9th, was later introduced as the state holiday, the Victory Day in the Soviet Union.
So basically, one of the holidays is a legacy of the Soviet Union. Another one is the Worldwide Commemoration Day, which is May 8th. What is the difference between the approaches of commemoration and celebration of the Day of Victory over Nazism in World War II and, well, it tributes the fallen heroes, and the Day of Remembrance and Reconciliation, which commemorates victims?
Well, the European and the worldwide approach is in its name, in its title, to commemorate, to think not about war, but about peace, about reconciliation, and to remember all victims who perished on all fronts of the World War, not just in Europe, but in North Africa, on the Pacific, and other territories. But the Soviet and modern Russian approach is, it's like, I think, it brings militarism, it brings exaggerated pathos, that it praises not peace but war. It tries
military strength, and this aggression is always in the parade.
I think that this style, it became a sort of religion, where Soviet side becomes the side of the good, and the German Nazi side becomes the side of the evil, or the devil, like a battle between angels and demons. And so all who don't fit in these simple conceptions, they are treated by this approach like traitors, like I don't know, like enemies, etc.
So basically, Soviet approach is built on the confrontation of two sides.
Yes, it is.
Well, and previously in Ukraine, just as in former Soviet Union countries, as in Russia, we had this huge military parades celebrated with fireworks, and there was this cult of military commanders, of different military personnel, generals. But it looks like after 2015, when Ukraine adopted this new world approach to commemorate victims, to talk about peace, to talk about no war life, looks like Ukraine kind of changed the approach more onto personal stories. Did you notice that?
Yes, I did.
Shifted. There was some kind of shift from this big attention towards the military, towards the significance of the army or the Red Army, and then it kind of shifted more onto personal stories, onto tragedies or stories of survivors, and now people more talk about this.
Yes, it is. It is. I noticed it exactly. And I also contributed to foster such change, such shift, because we in the Center for Research on the Liberation Movement created several exhibitions which consider World War II concentration camps, other liberation movement stories, and we try not to focus on some generalizations, but to focus on the personalities and to show the overall history through the prism of some concrete personal story.
Well, speaking of these two holidays, right? As we started our conversation, do you think that Ukraine needs to celebrate or commemorate, to pay tribute within the 2 days, to celebrate two holidays, or does Ukraine need to adopt only one style of commemoration?
To my mind, Ukraine will come to one day in the end sometimes, but nowadays, I think it is necessary to preserve for some time these 2 days, because the tradition is not implemented so fast.
Yes, you cannot just change it like that.
Yeah, and we need some time. So for people to get used to it, we need some time that, especially people who were born and who were raised in the Soviet Union and in Soviet traditions. So I think they need to be explained what is going on and why do we need to change these approaches. So for some period of time, we will have two parallel holidays. The Reconciliation Day and the Victory Day, but in the end, I think the Reconciliation Day will win.
Well, but only one of them is a day off. Usually a holiday in Ukraine is a day off, and that's May 9th. This has been always like this since times of USSR, but now the head of the Ukrainian Institute of National Remembrance, Volodymyr Vyatrovich, proposes to shift the day off from the 9th onto the 8th, because May 9th, according to him, carries all sorts of political provocations and manipulations. This was the quote. What is your take on this proposal?
Well, as I've just said,
you think that is going to be one day?
The future is for the May of 8th. So it is, I think, naturally that the day off will also move to this previous day.
And could you please explain our international audience why was it crucial for Ukraine to rename the holiday, the Victory Day, onto the Day of Victory Over Nazism in World War II, to have this accuracy, this preciseness in the name?
The matter was that our neighboring country, the Russian Federation, in fact monopolized this concept of victory, and the Russian authorities make it clear that victory was our common victory. We, the Russians, were the leaders of this victory, so we need to be the leaders for all post-Soviet countries in nowadays. And this has been one of the pillars for the all pro-Russian policy in this our Eastern European region. So we need to make stress on our Ukrainian history of the World War II, because our Ukrainian interest in that war was not the same as the Russian one.
Which one was it? Basically, I think you want to explain that for Ukraine back then was occupied by the USSR, and it also had its national interest, or interest of becoming an independent state, and this holiday cannot be fully treated as the Victory Day since Ukraine was occupied and suppressed by the Soviet Union.
Correct, okay. Because we cannot talk about the full liberation of Ukraine in 1945, because we expelled Nazis, we defeated the German occupiers, but the Soviet regime was in Ukraine until 1991. Mm-hmm.
How would you rate the level of awareness of Ukrainians about May 8th, May 9th, and generally about the World War II?
If we talk about World War II in general, this topic, I think, is rather popular among Ukrainians, and unfortunately, even politicians speculate over this too much. What about the May 8th? Over the last 5 years, I think our Institute of National Remembrance and other authorities made much effort to explain to the Ukrainian people that what is the point of the Memory and Reconciliation Day. But still, 5 years was not enough, and we have a lot of work. So I think the next 5 or even 10 years, this would be that period during which I think the Ukrainian nations would accept fully this concept.
Well, I do have some statistics. In 2013, 40% of the polled citizens of Ukraine indicated Victory Day in the top 5 most important holidays. But then in 2018, there were 31% of respondents with the same opinion. This is according to the Kyiv International Institute of Sociology data. So, what sort of message should be passed on to the younger generation and also to the adult generation so we can kind of increase that awareness and increase that need to remember our past? Because if we go to Berlin, every street basically remembers about the tragedy, and there is a feeling that the whole city is feeling the whole sorrow and tragedy about what happened, and you can read an apology out of everything, basically. Buildings, then the plaques on the walls, different memorial centers. What message should be passed on to Ukrainians so this level of awareness is not falling down?
I think the message should be the following, that the World War II was the result of policy of totalitarian regimes, both Nazi and the Soviet ones. And, well, I think that democracy could be the only the only thing that could prevent the outbreak of such world wars. And the other point that Ukraine was not independent before the war and during the World War II, and that's why Ukrainians had to fight not for their own interests, not for their own independent country, but for the other countries. And the losses we suffered in that war, the huge losses, were even not least due to this fact. And younger generation have to keep in mind that only Ukrainian independent state could prevent such wars. And Ukrainians who live and who stand for their country, even only in this situation, they would fight for their own interest.
Well, this is a perfect conclusion for our conversation. Thank you so much for your comments, and thank you for being a guest today in our studio. That was Igor Bigun, historian at the Center for Research on the Liberation Movement. Thank you for watching Head to Head, and stay tuned for more with UATV.